Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps stories like mine reach the people who need them. I always believed that love, even when uneven, still left a trace of fairness behind. That was something my mother used to say when I was young, back when her voice still sounded gentle to me. Life isn't equal, she'd tell me while brushing my hair, but love always leaves something behind. I held on to that sentence for most of my life, repeating it quietly every time my brother Daniel was chosen first, praised louder, forgiven faster. I told myself that what I lacked in attention would be balanced someday by understanding. I didn't know then how wrong I was, or how carefully my mother had arranged the pieces long before her final breath. The day of the will reading, the lawyer's office smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. I remember the sound of the ceiling fan ticking above us, the way Daniel bounced his knee like he was waiting for a bus instead of the verdict of our childhood. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, nails pressed into my skin, already bracing for disappointment, but not for erasure. When the lawyer cleared his throat and read the words, it felt like they came from underwater. The house, the savings, the land my mother inherited from her parents, everything, left to my brother. I was mentioned once, almost as an afterthought, allotted a small, sentimental item and a line that said my mother trusted Daniel to take care of me if needed. I didn't cry. That surprised everyone, including me. Daniel looked over with something like guilt flashing across his face, then relief. The lawyer avoided my eyes. I nodded, thanked him politely, and walked out into the parking lot where the sun was too bright and the world felt insultingly normal. I remember thinking that this must be what it feels like to disappear while still breathing. People will tell you inheritance doesn't define love. They'll say money reveals character but doesn't create it. I used to believe those things too, but when a parent leaves everything to one child and nothing to the other, it's not about money. It's about the story they're telling from the grave, and my mother's story was clear. Daniel mattered more. Growing up, it had always been that way, just subtle enough to excuse. Daniel was sensitive, so his outbursts were forgiven. I was strong, so my silence was expected. If he failed a class, my mother blamed the teacher. If I succeeded, she warned me not to get arrogant. At family dinners, she'd beam when he spoke and gently redirect when I did. I learned early that love in our house had rules, and I was better off not asking what they were. After the funeral, people came to me with sympathy that felt rehearsed. "Your mother loved you," they said, like it was a spell that might undo the paperwork. Daniel offered to help if I ever needed anything, his voice careful, practiced. I told him I was fine. I went back to my small apartment, surrounded by furniture I'd bought myself, walls I'd painted myself, a life I'd built quietly without help. I told myself I didn't need her money, didn't need her approval, but grief has a way of loosening old knots, and once they start to unravel, you can't always stop your hands from pulling. A week later, I returned to my mother's house to collect the one thing she'd left me, a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. Daniel had already begun sorting through the rest, labeling rooms like he was preparing a property listing. He told me to take my time. I told him I wouldn't be long. Walking into my childhood bedroom felt like stepping into a paused version of myself. The air was stale, the curtains half drawn, everything exactly where I'd left it years ago, like my life had ended there and no one had noticed. The jewelry box sat on my dresser, lighter than I remembered. I opened it and found the velvet lining worn thin, empty, except for a folded envelope tucked beneath the false bottom. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting, shaky but deliberate. For a moment, I just stared at it, my heart thudding like it knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I told myself it was probably a letter, maybe an apology she couldn't say out loud. I told myself not to expect too much. Inside the envelope were copies of documents, yellowed and carefully organized, bank statements, deeds, a handwritten ledger with dates and amounts, and beneath it all a letter, not addressed to me, but to herself, written years earlier, like a confession she never intended to deliver. As I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, reading through those pages, the story I'd been told my entire life began to crack. The house hadn't always been hers. The savings hadn't come from my father's job alone. There were accounts opened in my name when I was a child, closed without my knowledge. Money transferred out, redirected, renamed. My mother hadn't just favored my brother, she had taken from me to give to him, quietly, methodically, telling herself she was protecting the child who needed more. I felt sick, not with anger at first, but with a kind of grief that was heavier than loss. This wasn't neglect, it was a decision, a pattern, a truth she hid so well that even I had learned to doubt my own memories. I realized then that the will wasn't a final betrayal, it was the last step in a long plan. I put the papers back into the envelope, my hands trembling, and closed the jewelry box. In the hallway, I could hear Daniel on the phone, laughing, talking about renovations. For the first time, I wondered what he knew, whether he'd been complicit or simply the beneficiary of a story he never questioned. I realized something else, too, something that scared me more than confrontation. My mother had counted on my silence. She'd built her legacy on the assumption that I would swallow this like I always had. Driving home that day, the letter sat heavy in my bag. I didn't know yet what I would do, only that I couldn't unknow what I'd learned. Truth has weight, and once you carry it, you have to decide whether to set it down or let it change the way you walk. My mother left everything to my brother, but she had left me the truth, hidden where she thought I'd never look. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I was willing to protect her story. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope sat on my kitchen table, untouched, like it might speak if I let it. Every few minutes I'd get up, pace, pour water I wouldn't drink, then sit again and stare at the wall. I kept hearing my mother's voice, calm and certain, telling me that families survive by not digging too deep. She used to say that when neighbors gossiped or relatives fought. Some truths, she'd whisper, are better left buried. I had believed her for so long that even now, with proof in my hands, part of me felt like a traitor for wanting to dig. By morning, grief had hardened into something sharper. I laid the papers out carefully, reading every line again, slower this time. The ledger was the worst. Dates that matched milestones in my life, the year I got into college, the year I moved out, amounts withdrawn, transferred to accounts in Daniel's name. My mother's handwriting grew more confident with time, as if she'd convinced herself she was doing the right thing. I remembered her telling me she couldn't help with tuition, that things were tight. I remembered working 2 jobs, pretending it didn't hurt. All that time, the money had existed, it just wasn't meant for me. I wanted to call Daniel immediately, to demand answers, to hear his voice crack under the weight of the truth. But something stopped me. I needed to know how much he knew before I spoke. So instead, I called the lawyer listed on one of the documents, a man who had retired years ago but still answered his phone with the same professional calm. When I explained who I was, there was a pause long enough for me to feel my pulse in my ears. He told me he remembered my mother well. He told me he couldn't discuss details without authorization, then added quietly that some families make choices they regret too late. That was enough. I thanked him and hung up, my hands shaking again, this time with clarity. The truth wasn't an accident. It had been planned, protected by silence and legal language, hidden behind the mask of maternal concern. My mother hadn't trusted me with it because she knew I might object, or worse, expose it. Daniel invited me over a few days later to talk things through. He sounded nervous, overly kind, like someone rehearsing empathy. His new confidence didn't sit well on him. When I arrived, the house already looked different. Fresh paint samples on the wall, boxes stacked in corners. He offered me coffee, asked how I was holding up, avoided the subject like it might bite him if named. Finally, he sighed and said he hoped I understood that Mom had made her choices for reasons we might never fully grasp. I took the envelope out of my bag and placed it on the table between us. The sound it made felt loud in the quiet room. His eyes dropped to it, then back to mine, confusion flickering before recognition. He didn't ask what it was. He knew. That was the moment something shifted inside me, the last fragile hope that he was innocent collapsing under the weight of his silence. "She didn't just leave you everything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "She took it from me first." He didn't deny it. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face, and told me she'd explained it years ago, that I was strong, capable, that I'd be fine without it, that he needed more help, more stability. He said it like he was repeating a lesson, not confessing a theft. I realized then how carefully my mother had shaped not just the outcome, but the narrative. She'd trained him to see this as fairness. I asked him if he ever questioned it. He shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. It was Mom. She knew what she was doing. That sentence hurt more than anything else, because it told me that in his mind, her authority outweighed my right to my own life. I left without yelling, without tears, carrying my envelope back to my car like a second heart. On the drive home, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I wasn't going to fight him in private. I wasn't going to beg for scraps of what should have been mine. I was going to tell the truth. Exposing it wasn't about revenge, at least not in the way people like to imagine. It was about refusing to carry a lie that had shaped my entire existence. I started with the family. An email, carefully worded, attaching copies of the documents, explaining without accusation. I expected backlash. I expected denial. What I didn't expect was the quiet flood of messages that followed. Aunts and cousins who said they'd always wondered. Family friends who admitted my mother had confided in them, framing it as sacrifice, not theft. Even a distant uncle who told me my grandparents intended the inheritance to be split evenly, but trusted my mother to handle it. The truth spread faster than I anticipated, rippling outward in conversations I wasn't part of. Daniel called, angry now, accusing me of ruining her memory. I told him I wasn't responsible for protecting a legacy built on lies. He hung up on me. For the first time in my life, I didn't chase after reconciliation. There were nights I doubted myself. I'd lie awake wondering if I'd gone too far, if silence would have been kinder. But then I'd remember the ledger, the years of quiet struggle, the way my mother had smiled while telling me no. I realized kindness without honesty isn't kindness at all. It's control wearing a softer face. The fallout was messy. Family gatherings became tense or non-existent. Daniel stopped speaking to me entirely. But something else happened too. People began asking questions they'd never dared to ask before, about favoritism, about secrets, about the cost of keeping peace at the expense of truth. I found myself having conversations I'd never had growing up, where my feelings weren't minimized or dismissed. It didn't fix everything, but it changed the air around me, like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. I didn't take legal action. That choice surprised some people, but for me, it wasn't about reclaiming the money. It was about reclaiming myself. I wanted my mother's story to end where it deserved to, not rewritten to absolve her, not hidden to protect others' comfort. When people ask me now if I regret exposing the truth, I tell them regret belongs to the people who created the lie. I just refuse to inherit it. After the truth came out, silence settled in strange places. My phone stopped buzzing with Daniel's name. Family group chats went quiet, then slowly reformed without me, like a body learning to live around a missing limb. At first, that hurt more than I expected. Even after everything, part of me still wanted to be chosen, still wanted someone to say I'd done the right thing without hesitation. But validation doesn't always come loudly, and sometimes it arrives disguised as peace. Weeks passed, and with them came a kind of emotional withdrawal. I realized how much energy I'd spent my whole life anticipating my mother's reactions, adjusting myself to fit her expectations, shrinking or stretching depending on what would keep things calm. Without her voice guiding those reflexes, I felt untethered. Small decisions felt heavier than they should have. What to say, who to call, how honest to be. It was like learning to walk without a map I'd never agreed to follow in the first place. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, the envelope thick and unfamiliar. It was from my Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, a woman I'd always known as polite but distant. Inside, she wrote that she'd needed time to process what I'd shared. She admitted she'd known pieces of it for years, suspected more, but had chosen not to interfere. "Your mother was very convincing," she wrote, "and very afraid." That sentence lingered with me. Afraid of what? Of losing control? Of facing herself? Margaret apologized for her silence, not with excuses, but with ownership. It wasn't absolution, but it mattered. She invited me to visit. I hesitated before agreeing, unsure what I'd gain from reopening old doors. But when I arrived, sitting across from her at a small kitchen table that smelled like coffee and cinnamon, I felt something soften. She told me stories about my mother I'd never heard, about how she'd always been the one who managed, who decided, who carried the family's image like a shield, how Daniel reminded her of herself in ways I never had. "She didn't know how to love you without losing something," Margaret said quietly, and instead of learning, she chose certainty. That didn't excuse anything, but it gave shape to the wound. Edges where before there was only pain. Understanding isn't forgiveness, but it can be a kind of release. I left that day feeling lighter, not because the past had changed, but because it no longer felt like a mystery designed to make me doubt myself. Daniel, on the other hand, doubled down. He told relatives I'd manipulated documents, that grief had made me unstable. Hearing that hurt, but it also confirmed what I'd begun to accept. He needed the lie as much as my mother had. Without it, he'd have to face not just what he'd gained, but what it had cost me, and that was a debt he wasn't ready to acknowledge. There was a moment, months later, when he showed up unannounced at my apartment. I almost didn't open the door. When I did, he looked smaller, less certain. He said the house felt wrong, that living there came with a constant sense of being watched. He asked if I'd help him understand Mom's paperwork, said it was overwhelming. I listened, arms crossed, heart steady. I told him I'd already helped enough by telling the truth, that what he was feeling wasn't confusion, it was consequence. He left angry, but also shaken, and for the first time I saw the crack in the armor my mother had built around him. As the seasons changed, so did I. I started therapy, something I'd avoided for years because I'd been taught to endure, not examine. Naming the patterns out loud felt radical. Favoritism, financial abuse, emotional neglect, words I'd never allowed myself to use because they felt too harsh, too dramatic. But once spoken, they lost their power to shame me. I wasn't weak for being affected. I was human. I also began reconnecting with parts of myself I'd buried. I traveled, small trips at first, then bigger ones. I spent money without guilt, not recklessly, but freely, as someone allowed to enjoy what she earned. I formed friendships where I didn't have to perform strength to be worthy of care. Slowly, the story of my life shifted from what I'd been denied to what I was building. People still ask me sometimes if I think my mother loved me. It's a complicated question, one I don't answer lightly. I believe she loved me in the way she knew how, which was limited by fear and control. But love that requires erasure isn't love I'm willing to honor without honesty. I can hold grief for who she was and still tell the truth about what she did. Those things aren't opposites. The biggest change came quietly. One morning, I realized I hadn't thought about the inheritance in weeks. Not the money, not the house, not even the betrayal. What remained was a sense of ownership over my own narrative. I wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. I was the woman who refused to keep a secret that cost her her life, piece by piece. Exposing the truth didn't restore my family, it redefined it. Some bridges burned, others were never real to begin with, but in their place something steadier grew, self-respect, and that, I've learned, is an inheritance no one can take from you, no matter how carefully they plan. There's a strange kind of grief that comes after the anger fades. It's quieter, heavier, and it doesn't announce itself with tears or raised voices. It arrives in ordinary moments, like when you pass a house that looks like the one you grew up in, or when you hear someone say, "A mother's love is unconditional." I felt it most in the mornings, standing at my kitchen sink, watching the light creep across the counter, realizing there was no one left to explain myself to, no one left whose approval I was unconsciously chasing. That absence felt both freeing and unbearably sad. As time went on, the family adjusted around the truth the way people always do, by choosing which parts to remember and which to quietly ignore. Some relatives treated me with a new kind of careful respect, like I was fragile glass. Others avoided me altogether, their discomfort louder than any accusation. I stopped trying to manage their reactions. For the first time, I let their feelings belong to them. That was harder than it sounds. When you're raised to keep the peace, walking away from conflict feels like a failure, even when it's an act of self-preservation. I found myself thinking more about my mother, not with longing, but with curiosity. Who had she been before fear shaped her choices, before she decided that love could be measured, rationed, redirected? I went through old photos, not looking for proof of affection, but for clues. In many of them, she stood slightly apart, watching rather than participating, her smile practiced. I wondered how early she learned that control felt safer than trust. Understanding her didn't soften what she'd done, but it helped me see that the story hadn't started with me. I'd just been written into it without consent. One evening, I sat down and wrote her a letter I never intended to send. I told her how I felt to grow up invisible, how every "you'll be fine" landed like a dismissal, how exhausting it was to be cast as strong so no one had to worry about me. I didn't accuse, I didn't justify, I just told the truth, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. When I finished, I didn't feel relief so much as alignment, like something inside me had finally been named. I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of a drawer, not as a message to her, but as a record for myself. Daniel resurfaced in indirect ways. A cousin mentioned he was struggling to maintain the house. Another said he'd taken out a loan, that the inheritance hadn't solved his problems the way everyone assumed it would. I felt no satisfaction hearing that, only a quiet recognition. Favoritism doesn't prepare you for accountability. It cushions you from consequences until they arrive all at once. I hoped in a distant way that he'd eventually confront the truth instead of running from it, but I no longer felt responsible for guiding him there. The more distance I gained, the more clearly I saw how deeply the old dynamic had shaped me. I noticed how often I apologized unnecessarily, how instinctively I downplayed my needs, how my first response to praise was deflection. These weren't personality quirks, they were survival strategies. Recognizing that was uncomfortable, but it gave me something I'd never had before: choice. I could keep living as if love had to be earned, or I could start believing that my existence alone was enough. I began to speak more openly about my experience, not to air grievances, but to name patterns that thrive in silence. People listened. Some shared their own stories of being the strong one, the overlooked one, the child expected to understand too much too soon. There was a strange comfort in realizing my story wasn't unique, that it was part of a larger, unspoken reality many families live inside without language. If telling the truth gave someone else permission to question their own, then the fallout had been worth it. There were days I missed my mother, not the woman she was, but the idea of what she could have been. That loss felt sharper than anything money could represent. No inheritance can replace a relationship that never fully existed. Accepting that meant grieving something abstract, something I'd hoped for but never had. It was a different kind of mourning, one without rituals or condolences, but it was real all the same. As the year turned, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would stop measuring my worth by who chose me last. I would build a life where love didn't require performance, where generosity didn't come with strings attached. I couldn't change the past, but I could refuse to let it define my future. My mother left everything to my brother, believing she was securing his life and shaping my silence. What she didn't account for was resilience, born not from favoritism but from endurance. By exposing the truth, I didn't destroy my family, I revealed it. And in doing so, I finally gave myself what I'd been denied for so long: the freedom to live honestly without shrinking to make others comfortable. Healing isn't a straight line. I learned that in the months that followed, when old feelings resurfaced without warning, triggered by things as small as a song on the radio or a comment from a stranger. There were days I felt steady and grounded, proud of myself for speaking the truth. And then there were days I felt like a child again, standing in a doorway, waiting to be noticed. The difference was that now, when those moments came, I didn't shame myself for them. I sat with them, I listened, I let them pass instead of pushing them down. I began to understand that my mother's favoritism had taught me something dangerous, that love was scarce, that if I didn't ask for too much, didn't take up too much space, maybe I'd be rewarded with acceptance. That belief had followed me into adulthood, shaping my relationships in ways I'd never fully acknowledged. I tolerated imbalance. I overgave. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. Naming that pattern didn't erase it overnight, but it gave me the power to interrupt it. One afternoon, I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store. She hugged me tightly and said she'd heard everything. Her tone suggested judgment, but her eyes were soft. She told me my mother had loved me in her own way, that she'd done what she thought was best. I nodded politely, then surprised myself by saying calmly that intent doesn't erase impact. The words felt solid in my mouth. True. I walked away feeling taller, not because I'd won an argument, but because I hadn't abandoned myself to keep the peace. Around that time, I started volunteering at a local community center, helping young women with basic financial planning, budgeting, saving, understanding credit, things no one had ever taught me because it was assumed I didn't need help. Sitting across from those women, hearing their fears and ambitions, I felt something click into place. Knowledge had been used against me, withheld to maintain control. Sharing it now felt like reclaiming stolen ground. Every question I answered, every small breakthrough I witnessed, stitched something back together inside me. Daniel remained distant, but his absence no longer felt like rejection. It felt like a boundary, one he'd chosen and I'd accepted. I stopped checking in through mutual contacts, stopped wondering if he'd regret his choices. Regret, I'd learned, can't be forced. It has to be faced. And some people would rather live comfortably with a lie than uncomfortably with the truth. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I visited her grave alone. I hadn't planned to. I just found myself driving there, parking under a sky that looked too blue for mourning. I stood quietly, hands in my coat pockets, and told her about my life. Not accusing, not pleading, just informing. I told her I was okay, that I was building something honest, that I hoped she'd found the peace she'd never allowed herself in life. I didn't forgive her that day, but I let go of the need for an apology that would never come. Walking back to my car, I realized something profound. Forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about releasing yourself from the role you were assigned in someone else's story. I had spent years as the dependable one, the understanding one, the daughter who didn't need much. I was done playing that part. My life didn't become perfect after the truth came out. Bills still arrived, loneliness still visited, but there was an honesty to my days that made even the hard moments feel real, lived, mine. I laughed more freely, I rested without guilt, I trusted my instincts instead of second-guessing them. These weren't dramatic transformations. They were quiet, steady shifts, the kind that last. Sometimes people ask me what I gained by exposing my mother's secret. They expect a dramatic answer, closure, justice, vindication. I tell them the truth. I gained myself. I gained the right to stop pretending that betrayal wrapped in love is still love. I gained a future not dictated by fear or favoritism. My mother left everything to my brother. That fact will never change. But what she couldn't take, what she couldn't control, was my voice. And once I learned to use it, really use it, I discovered that telling the truth wasn't the end of my family story. It was the beginning of my own. As my life settled into this new, quieter rhythm, I started noticing how deeply silence had shaped me. Not just the silence I'd kept for my mother, but the silence I'd learned to live inside. I had spent so many years anticipating disappointment that I rarely allowed myself to expect joy. Even after everything, even after choosing truth, I still caught myself bracing for loss before happiness could fully land. Awareness, I learned, doesn't instantly heal old wounds. It simply turns on the light. There were moments when guilt crept in unexpectedly. Not guilt over exposing the truth, but guilt for surviving it, for moving forward when others stayed stuck, for building a life that didn't revolve around managing someone else's comfort. I talked about this in therapy, embarrassed by how disloyal it felt to be at peace. My therapist said something that stayed with me. Guilt is often the echo of a boundary you were never allowed to have. Once I heard that, I began to recognize guilt not as a warning, but as a sign I was changing. I also began to reflect on how easily favoritism hides behind praise. My mother had always spoken proudly of my independence, my resilience, my maturity. Those words sounded like compliments, but they were expectations in disguise. They justified neglect. They excused imbalance. I realized how often society celebrates the child who doesn't need much without asking why they learned to need so little. That realization made me gentler with myself. Strength, I understood now, isn't about enduring quietly. It's about choosing honesty, even when it costs you familiarity. One evening, I attended a small family gathering I'd been hesitant to accept an invitation to. It was my cousin's birthday. Nothing dramatic, just a few people, shared food, careful conversation. I went in prepared to feel like an outsider, but something surprising happened. An older relative pulled me aside and thanked me. She said watching what happened had forced her to reconsider how she treated her own children, that she'd seen patterns she didn't like reflected back at her. I didn't know what to say. I'd never imagined my story could ripple outward like that. That night, driving home, I realized the truth doesn't just expose pain, it offers choice, to continue patterns or to break them. My mother had chosen certainty over courage. I was choosing differently. That didn't make me better than her. It made me responsible for what came next. Daniel eventually sent a message. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an accusation either, just a short note saying he hoped I was well. I stared at it for a long time before responding. I wrote back simply that I hoped the same for him. No explanations, no reopening wounds. Peace, I'd learned, doesn't always require closure. Sometimes it requires restraint. I thought often about legacy, about what we leave behind beyond property and possessions. My mother believed legacy was something you controlled, something you arranged, but legacy lives in people, in the stories they carry forward, in the patterns they repeat or refuse. By telling the truth, I hadn't erased her legacy, I'd made it honest, and by choosing to live differently, I was creating my own. The truth is, families don't fracture because of honesty, they fracture because of what honesty reveals. I didn't expose a secret that broke us. I exposed a wound that had already been there, quietly shaping everything around it. The difference was that now it had air, and air, even when it stings, allows healing. There are still days I miss the fantasy of what my family could have been. On those days, I let myself mourn it without judgment. I don't rush to gratitude. I don't force forgiveness. I trust that acceptance doesn't mean approval, it means clarity, and clarity has given me a life that finally feels like my own. If there's one lesson I carry with me now, it's this: being the strong one shouldn't cost you your truth. Love that demands silence isn't love, and inheritance isn't what you're given after someone dies, it's what you're taught to carry while they're alive. I chose not to carry the lie anymore, and in doing so, I finally stepped into a future that belonged to me. By the time another year passed, the story no longer felt raw in my body. It lived in my memory, yes, but not in my chest the way it once had. That was how I knew something fundamental had shifted. Pain that has been processed doesn't disappear, it settles. It becomes something you can carry without it cutting into your hands. I hadn't forgotten what my mother did, or what Daniel accepted, but I'd stopped reliving it as if it were still happening. I started to notice how differently I showed up in the world. I spoke more slowly, more deliberately, not rushing to explain myself or soften my words. I trusted pauses. I trusted silence when it felt earned, not imposed. In conversations, I no longer twisted myself into shapes that made others comfortable. If something felt unfair, I named it. If I needed help, I asked. These weren't dramatic acts of rebellion. They were quiet refusals to disappear. One moment stands out to me clearly. I was offered a leadership role at work, one I would have declined in the past out of habit, convinced someone else deserved it more. This time, I didn't deflect. I didn't list my shortcomings before accepting. I simply said yes. Walking home that evening, I realized how often I'd mistaken humility for worthiness. I'd been taught not to reach too high, not to expect too much. Saying yes felt like rewriting an old script, one choice at a time. Occasionally, someone new would learn about my family situation and ask, cautiously, if it was hard to live with the fallout. I'd tell them the truth. It was harder living inside the lie. It was harder pretending favoritism didn't shape me. It was harder doubting my own memories. The fallout had been painful, yes, but it was honest pain. And honest pain heals. I ran into Daniel unexpectedly one afternoon at a cafe across town. It had been months since our last exchange. He looked tired, older somehow. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. As he turned to leave, he hesitated, then said quietly that the house felt emptier than he'd imagined. I nodded. I didn't say I'd tried to warn him. I didn't say I understood. I let his words hang between us, unrescued. Sometimes allowing someone to feel the weight of their own reality is the kindest thing you can do. Later, I thought about my mother again, not with anger, but with a sober clarity. I saw her as a woman who confused control with care, who believed love was something you managed instead of something you practiced. I no longer needed to punish her in my mind. I no longer needed to defend her either. She was complex. She was flawed. She was responsible. Holding all of that at once felt like maturity, the kind I'd been forced into too early, but was finally choosing on my own terms. I've learned that truth doesn't guarantee reconciliation. It doesn't promise happy endings or restored relationships. What it offers is alignment, the relief of no longer living against yourself, the ability to wake up and recognize your own reflection without flinching. That kind of peace doesn't make headlines. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but it sustains you. When I look back now, I see how carefully my mother tried to script our lives, how sure she was that silence would protect her choices. What she didn't understand was that silence doesn't preserve love, it preserves fear. And fear always finds a way to surface, whether through resentment, distance, or truth spoken too late. My story isn't about inheritance anymore, it's about authorship, about deciding who gets to tell my story and what I'm willing to carry forward. I didn't expose the truth to punish my mother or to strip my brother of what he was given. I did it because I deserved to live without doubting my own reality. And now, when I think about what I'll leave behind someday, I don't think in terms of property or accounts. I think about honesty, about breaking patterns, about refusing to teach the next generation that love has to be earned through silence. That will be my legacy, and it will be enough. Time has a way of revealing what truly lasts. The intensity of anger fades, the sharp edges of grief dull, but the lessons remain, settling into the bones of your life. By the time I reached this stage, I wasn't telling my story to make sense of it anymore. I understood it. I was telling it to honor the woman I had become because of it. I noticed that my relationships had changed, not just in who I kept close, but in how I allowed myself to be seen. I no longer edited my past to make it more palatable. I didn't rush to reassure people that everything was fine. When asked about my family, I answered honestly, without bitterness or apology. That honesty acted like a filter. Some people drifted away, uncomfortable with depth. Others leaned in, grateful for permission to be real themselves. I learned to value the latter. One of the quiet gifts of this journey was learning to trust my memory. For years, I'd second-guessed myself, convinced that if something hurt, it must be because I was too sensitive, too demanding, too much. Exposing the truth forced me to confront how often I'd been right all along. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me steady. There's a strength that comes from knowing your perceptions are valid, that your feelings don't require external approval to exist. I began mentoring a younger colleague at work, someone who reminded me of myself years ago. Capable, reliable, overlooked. I encouraged her to speak up, to ask for what she deserved, to take credit for her work without shame. Watching her confidence grow felt like closing a circle I'd been trapped in for too long. It wasn't about fixing the past, it was about changing the future, one conversation at a time. Daniel faded further into the background of my life. Occasionally I'd hear updates through distant relatives, but they no longer stirred anything in me. I didn't wish him harm. I didn't wish him happiness either. I wished him awareness. Whether he ever found it was no longer my concern. Letting go of that responsibility was one of the final steps in reclaiming myself. I also stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't impacted by them. That urge to justify, to make myself understandable, had been ingrained in me early. Now I recognized it as another form of self-erasure. My story didn't need consensus to be true. It needed honesty. On a quiet evening, I reread the letter I'd written to my mother months earlier. The words no longer trembled. They read like a record of survival, not a plea. I realized then that I'd stopped seeking resolution from her memory. I had resolved myself. That felt like freedom. People often think closure is something someone else gives you, an apology, an acknowledgement, a change of heart. But closure, I learned, is something you claim. It's the moment you stop waiting for permission to move on. The moment you accept that some questions will remain unanswered and that those unanswered questions don't have to hold you hostage. My mother left everything to my brother, believing she was protecting him and simplifying the future. In reality, she left behind a complicated truth that demanded reckoning. I answered that demand not with revenge, but with honesty. And honesty gave me something no inheritance ever could: integrity. As I move forward, I carry this lesson with me. You don't owe silence to anyone who benefits from it. Love doesn't ask you to disappear, and the truth, no matter how disruptive, is always kinder than a lie that slowly teaches you to doubt yourself. This story doesn't end with reconciliation or restored family dinners. It ends with something quieter and stronger: self-respect. And that, I've learned, is the foundation everything else stands on. When I look back now, I can see that the hardest part wasn't exposing the truth. It was learning how to live without the roles that truth destroyed. For most of my life, I had been the reliable one, the understanding one, the daughter who made things easier by asking for less. Once that role disappeared, I had to decide who I was without it. That question lingered longer than the anger ever did. At first, the space it left behind felt uncomfortable, almost empty. I had so much free emotional energy that I didn't know where to place it. I wasn't managing my mother's moods anymore. I wasn't anticipating Daniel's needs. I wasn't calculating how to stay agreeable. That absence felt strange, like standing in a room after all the furniture has been removed. Slowly, though, I began to furnish it with things that belonged to me: curiosity, rest, ambition I'd been afraid to name. I took risks I would have once talked myself out of. I applied for opportunities that scared me. I voiced opinions without cushioning them in apology. Each time I did, there was a flicker of fear, followed by a deeper sense of alignment. I realized that confidence isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision not to let fear choose for you. There was a moment during a family holiday when I truly understood how far I'd come. A relative brought up my mother, speaking fondly, glossing over the harder truths. In the past, I would have stayed silent, letting the discomfort swallow me. This time, I gently said that my relationship with her had been complicated, that love and harm had coexisted, and that both deserved to be acknowledged. The room went quiet. No one argued. No one dismissed me. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. I hadn't been erased. Later that night, I cried alone, not from pain, but from relief. Relief that I could speak honestly and survive it. Relief that my voice no longer felt dangerous to use. I also thought more deeply about my father, about how his absence or passivity had made my mother's control possible. It would have been easy to redirect my anger there, to widen the list of people who failed me. Instead, I chose something harder. I chose to stop carrying blame as an identity. Understanding doesn't mean excusing. It means deciding where your energy belongs. Mine belonged to the life I was building now. As the years moved forward, my story became something I carried lightly. I didn't introduce myself through it. I didn't hide it either. It was simply part of my history, one chapter among many. The betrayal no longer defined me. My response to it did. Sometimes I imagine what my mother would say if she could see me now. I don't imagine apologies. I imagine confusion, perhaps even pride, twisted and unspoken. And that's okay. I no longer need her understanding to validate my choices. What I've learned is this: family secrets don't disappear when they're ignored. They sink into the foundation, warping everything built on top of them. Telling the truth doesn't destroy families. It gives them the chance to become honest, or to reveal that honesty was never the goal. My mother left everything to my brother, believing silence would protect her version of love. I exposed the truth not to rewrite her story, but to stop living inside it. And in doing so, I finally learned that peace doesn't come from being chosen by others. It comes from choosing yourself, even when it costs you the comfort of belonging. By the time I reached what felt like the far edge of this journey, I understood something I wish I'd known earlier. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, and strength doesn't mean you stop feeling the weight of what happened. It means the weight no longer decides where you're allowed to go. I carried my story with me, but it no longer carried me. I began to notice how differently I spoke to myself. The old voice that asked whether I was overreacting, whether I was being ungrateful, whether I should have just stayed quiet, had softened into something kinder. When mistakes happened, I didn't punish myself. When conflict arose, I didn't immediately assume I was at fault. That internal shift felt more significant than any external validation I'd ever received. It was proof that the truth had taken root where silence once lived. One quiet afternoon, while organizing old documents, I came across the envelope again, the one that had started everything. The papers inside no longer made my hands shake. They felt like artifacts from another life. I considered throwing them away, then decided against it, not because I needed proof anymore, but because they represented a moment when I chose myself over comfort. I placed them in a folder labeled simply History and put them back. Some things don't need to be revisited, only acknowledged. I reflected often on how easy it would have been to stay silent, to accept the inheritance decision as fate, to tell myself that love was complicated and move on without disruption. People praise that kind of endurance. They call it maturity, but I've learned that endurance without honesty slowly teaches you to abandon yourself, and no amount of approval can fill that space once it's hollowed out. As I moved forward, I became intentional about the family I chose, friends who listened without fixing, relationships where care flowed both ways, moments of joy that didn't come with conditions. These connections didn't replace what I'd lost, but they showed me what had always been possible. Love that didn't require sacrifice of self, support that didn't depend on silence. I also made peace with the idea that not everyone would understand my choices. Some still believe I should have let things lie, that exposing the truth was unnecessary. I don't argue with them anymore. Their discomfort isn't my responsibility. My responsibility is to live in a way that doesn't betray the woman I worked hard to become. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop hoping people will change and start accepting who they are. My mother was someone who chose control over connection. My brother was someone who accepted advantage over fairness. I was someone who chose truth over belonging. Those choices shaped our paths. They still do. If this story has taught me anything, it's that inheritance isn't just about what you receive after someone is gone. It's about the emotional debts passed down quietly, the expectations you're trained to carry, the roles you're assigned without consent. Breaking free from that inheritance takes courage, it takes honesty, and it often takes being misunderstood. My mother left everything to my brother. She believed that would be the final word. But the truth has a way of outliving intention. By exposing it, I didn't rewrite the past. I reclaimed the present. And that, I've learned, is the most powerful form of justice there is. Now, standing at the far end of this story, I can finally see it as a whole instead of a wound I was still inside. Time didn't erase what happened, but it gave me perspective. It showed me how one decision made in silence can echo across decades, and how one decision made in truth can stop that echo from passing any further. I've come to understand that my mother's greatest fear wasn't losing me, it was losing control of the story she told herself about who she was. In her version, she was practical, protective, wise. Admitting what she'd done would have shattered that image. So she hid it. She justified it. And in doing so, she taught me a lesson she never intended to teach, that love without accountability becomes harm, no matter how softly it's delivered. There was a time when I thought exposing the truth meant choosing conflict forever, that I'd be defined by this fracture for the rest of my life. But what actually happened was quieter and far more lasting. I learned discernment. I learned how to recognize when something felt wrong and trust that feeling instead of explaining it away. I learned that peace built on silence isn't peace at all. It's postponement. I don't talk about my inheritance story much anymore, unless someone asks or unless I sense that my honesty might help someone else feel less alone. When I do tell it, I don't emphasize the money or the house. I talk about the moment I realized my life had been shaped by a lie and the moment I chose not to carry it forward. That's the part that matters. Daniel remains a distant figure in my life, more symbol than presence now. I wish him growth. I wish him clarity, but I no longer wish him remorse for my sake. His journey isn't mine to manage. Letting go of that responsibility was the final release, the moment I truly stepped out of the role my mother had written for me. I sometimes think about the younger version of myself, the one who believed strength meant endurance and love meant patience without limits. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this: you are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to notice patterns. You are allowed to want fairness, not as a reward, but as a baseline. And you are allowed to speak, even if your voice shakes. My mother left
everything to my brother, believing she was deciding the ending. What she didn't realize is that endings don't belong to the person who controls the most. They belong to the person who tells the truth last. By exposing what she hid, I didn't dishonor her memory. I told it honestly. And honesty, even when it's painful, is the only way stories stop hurting the people who live inside them. This is where my story rests now. Not in anger, not in grief, but in clarity. I carry what happened with wisdom instead of weight. I walk forward without the burden of silence, without the need to be chosen, without the fear that truth will cost me everything. Because I've learned something simple and unshakable. Losing a false sense of belonging is not the same as losing yourself. Sometimes it's how you finally find yourself.
There's something quietly powerful about realizing your story no longer needs an audience to be real. For a long time, I thought closure required witnesses, that truth needed agreement to matter. But as I moved further away from the moment everything broke open, I understood that the deepest healing happened when no one was watching. It happened in the small, private choices I made every day to live differently than I had been taught. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen, stopped imagining what I'd say if Daniel finally apologized, or if my mother could somehow hear me now. Those imagined dialogues had kept me emotionally tethered to a past that no longer deserved my energy. Letting them go felt like setting down a heavy bag I hadn't realized I was still carrying. My mind grew quieter. My days felt more spacious. I noticed how my body responded to that freedom. My shoulders relaxed. My sleep deepened. I laughed without that familiar undercurrent of vigilance. Trauma doesn't just live in memory, it lives in the nervous system. And safety, real safety, begins when you stop anticipating harm from people who no longer have access to you. I became more intentional about what I said yes to: invitations, commitments, emotional labor. I no longer agreed to things out of obligation or fear of disappointing someone. Each yes became a choice instead of a reflex. Each no became an act of respect, not defiance. This was new territory for me, and at times it felt uncomfortable, even selfish. But discomfort, I learned, isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's just evidence that you're growing beyond old constraints. There were moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, not for my mother as she was, but for the relationship we never had the chance to build honestly. I let myself feel that grief without trying to resolve it. Some losses don't need solutions, they need acknowledgement. Allowing that sadness to exist alongside gratitude for my present life felt like balance, not contradiction. I also thought about the kind of ancestor I wanted to be, even if I never had children of my own. We're all ancestors to someone, shaping norms, modeling behavior, leaving emotional footprints behind. I wanted mine to reflect courage, not compliance, truth, not convenience. I wanted the people who came after me to know that silence is not the price of love. Occasionally, someone would reach out after hearing my story, quietly, almost cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. They'd say they were living inside a similar dynamic, that they didn't know how to name it yet. I never told them what to do. I didn't give ultimatums or advice. I simply told them what I'd learned, that their feelings mattered, that patterns don't break on their own, and that honesty, while costly, is survivable. Watching others begin to question what they'd been taught felt like planting seeds I might never see grow, and that was enough. My relationship with money changed too, not because I suddenly had more of it, but because I no longer associated it with worth or approval. I spent intentionally. I saved intentionally. I gave intentionally. Each decision came from agency, not scarcity. The inheritance my mother had orchestrated lost its symbolic power over me. It became just a fact, no longer a verdict. There's a quiet confidence that settles in when you stop seeking permission to exist fully. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply shows up in how you move through the world, how you hold your head, how you speak your truth without bracing for punishment. That confidence became my companion, steady and unassuming. If I could distill everything I've learned into one truth, it would be this: you can love people deeply and still refuse to protect their harmful choices. Those two things are not opposites, they are boundaries. And boundaries are not walls, they are the structures that allow healthy relationships to exist at all. My mother left everything to my brother, believing that control would secure peace and silence would preserve love. What she couldn't foresee was that truth has a life of its own. It waits, it watches, and eventually it finds a voice willing to carry it into the light. That voice became mine. This is where I leave the story now, not with a dramatic ending, but with a steady beginning that continues every day. I choose honesty over habit, self-respect over approval, and clarity over comfort. I don't know what the future holds, but I know who I am as I walk into it, and that knowledge is the inheritance I will carry for the rest of my life.